It gives me goosebumps to read this every year. And I get excited about doing it. Sometimes I forget, and I remember this time. And I like to, when I read the Declaration of Independence, put myself in the room. I'm the one delivering this message. And I think that more Americans should think more about this document and what it says and where the people were at the time when they put this together and how they felt and what they risked. We're talking about James Madison and John Jay and Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, all names that we know, all people who will go down in world history for all of time as having created this fantastic, overachieving, world-changing civilization that we all call the West, and in particular, we call the United States. So with that said, and with much admiration, I am honored to get to read this again this July 3rd, coming up tomorrow, July 4th, 2023. Let's go back, though. In Congress, July 4th, 1776. This is to the King. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among those are life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to then institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and their happiness. You see, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. No, but accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, no, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferances of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world, because the king has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws on immediate and pressing importance, unless, of course, suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He's refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected. whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions from within. He has endeavored to prevent the populations of these states for the purpose of obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount of payment for their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to jurisdictions foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders for which they commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without any consent, for depriving us, in many cases, of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretend offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. This king has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas and ravaged our coasts and burned our towns and destroyed the lives of our people. He is, at this time, transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their own countries, to become their executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We've warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We've appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. We have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. But they too have been deaf to the voice of justice. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity, which denounces our separation, and hold them as we have held the rest of mankind, enemies in war, but in peace friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved of all the allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And that as a free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. This greatest document ever written was signed by some of the most impressive and immeasurable men ever. In Georgia, it was signed by Button Gwinnett, Lyman Hall, and George Walton. In North Carolina, William Hooper, Joseph Hughes, John Penn. In South Carolina, Edward Rutledge, Thomas Haywood Jr., Thomas Lynch Jr., and Arthur Middleton. And in Massachusetts, in the middle of the page, knowing the king would see it and not wanting his name missed, was John Hancock. In Maryland, Samuel Chase, William Paca, Thomas Stone, Charles Carroll of Carrollton. In Virginia, George Wythe, Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Harrison, Nelson Thomas Jr., Francis Lightfoot Lee, and Carter Braxton. In Pennsylvania, Robert Morris, Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Franklin, John Morton, George Clymer, James Smith, George Taylor, James Wilson, and George Ross. In Delaware, Caesar Rodney, George Reed, Thomas McCain. In Massachusetts, Samuel Adams, John Adams, Robert Treat Paine, and Elbridge Gerry. In New York, William Floyd, Philip Livingston, Francis Lewis, Lewis Morris. From Rhode Island was Stephen Hopkins and William Ellery. From Connecticut, Roger Sherman, Samuel Huntington, William Williams, and Oliver Wolcott. In New Jersey, Richard Stockton, John Witherspoon, Francis Hopkins, John Hart, and Abraham Clark. And finally, in New Hampshire, Josiah Bartlett and William Whipple. Happy July 4th to everybody, and happy birthday to the United States of America.